The mornings always started the same way, and I had come to depend on that sameness the way I once depended on things like alarm clocks and coffee makers, and the sound of traffic passing on the road below my old apartment window. I would wake before the sun, usually around 5, pulled out of sleep not by any sound, but by some deep animal instinct that had sharpened itself over the last 18 months into something I barely recognized as my own. Forrest would be at the foot of the bed, his big golden body a warm, steady weight against my legs, and Hunter would already be up, pacing quietly near the bedroom door the way he always did when the darkness outside was just beginning to thin. I would lie still for a moment, just listening. That was the first thing I always did. Listen. The wind off the hills, the creak of the house settling against it, the distant sound of one of the wind generators spinning slow or fast depending on the night, and underneath all of it, that profound and total silence that I had never quite gotten used to, no matter how many months had passed since the world went quiet. Then I would get up, pull on my boots, and we would start our day. The property sat at the end of a 2-mile dirt road that cut back through the pines off a county highway that no one used anymore. 40 acres of mixed terrain, some of it flat and open enough for the garden and the animal pens, some of it climbing up into rocky, tree-covered hillsides that gave us shelter from the worst of the winter winds and made the property feel hidden from the rest of the world in a way I had come to love more than I could explain. The manufacture home had been placed there 4 years before everything fell apart. Back when I bought the land with savings I had spent a decade building, dreaming of something quieter, something self-sufficient, something far away from the noise of the life I had been living. I had no idea then how important that dream was going to become. The house itself was nothing fancy. A 3-bedroom double-wide with a good metal roof and a wraparound porch that I had added myself the summer before the virus hit. But I had spent the last year and a half turning it into something that actually functioned as a long-term survival home, rather than just a weekend retreat. The solar array on the south-facing slope behind the house had been expanded 3 times, now using panels I had pulled from hardware stores and solar supply companies in the surrounding towns. And between that and the 3 wind generators mounted on the ridge above the property, I had more consistent power than I honestly needed most days. The battery bank in the utility shed was deep enough to carry me through 3 or 4 days of heavy cloud cover without dropping below 80%. And I had a backup propane generator for true emergencies, though I tried not to lean on it because propane was finite, and I was always thinking about what finite meant now in a way that I had never once thought about it before. Water came from a well that I tested religiously every 2 weeks using a kit I had stocked up on early, and the septic system had given me no real trouble aside from one anxious week in the spring when I thought I might have a drainage issue that turned out to be nothing more than a blocked vent pipe I fixed in an afternoon. The small things that would have been minor inconveniences before were life or death calculations now, and I had learned to treat them accordingly. I kept a maintenance log for every system on the property, updated it weekly, and read it every Sunday morning with my coffee, the way some people used to read the newspaper. Forrest and Hunter had come with me from my old life. Both of them rescued mutts who had no idea how lucky they were to belong to someone who had accidentally prepared herself for the end of the world. Forrest was a 5-year-old golden mix, big and calm and deeply intelligent in the way that good dogs are intelligent, not showy about it, but always tracking, always aware. Hunter was 3, leaner and darker, part shepherd and part something else that I had never been able to identify, and he was exactly what his name suggested. He had started hunting with me almost from the beginning, taking to it with an instinct that felt innate, flushing birds and tracking deer with a seriousness that I found deeply reassuring on the days when everything else felt uncertain. Together they were my alarm system, my hunting partners, my company on the long evenings when the silence got heavy, and my early warning system in a world where an early warning might be the difference between being prepared and being caught completely off guard. The garden took up roughly a 1/4 acre of the open flat ground to the east of the house, and by the second full growing season, I had it producing more than I could eat fresh, which was exactly the point. I had taught myself to kill in the summer before the virus, almost by accident, pulling up videos online one rainy weekend and falling down a rabbit hole that had ended with a pressure canner, 40 pounds of lids and rings, and a shelf in the basement that was already half full by the time the world ended. That shelf had saved my life in the first winter when the garden was still small, and the hunting was still something I was learning rather than something I was good at. Now, the basement held over 800 jars of preserved food, vegetables and fruit, and venison and chicken stock and bone broth, and everything else I had managed to put up across 2 full canning seasons. And I slept easier knowing it was there. The chickens had come from a farm 3 miles down the highway, a small operation that had been abandoned, so quickly the birds were still in their coops when I found them, thin and stressed but alive, and I had loaded 22 of them in the back of my truck and brought them home and built them a proper predator-proof coop behind the house. I lost 3 to a fox that first winter before I figured out how to reinforce the fencing, but the remaining 19 had been laying steadily ever since, and I had added 6 more the previous spring from another property I had scouted further out. The dairy cows were a longer story involving a borrowed stock trailer, a lot of slow and patient coaxing, and one genuinely terrifying afternoon when a 1,200-pound Holstein decided she did not want to move. I had to spend 45 minutes convincing her otherwise, but I had 3 of them now, and they provided more milk than I could use, which meant butter and cheese and a kind of richness to the diet that made the harder days feel a little more bearable. 3 other survivors. That was all I knew of. One was a man named Dale who had made contact over a ham radio setup I had running in the back bedroom. An older guy somewhere in Wyoming who had been a rancher all his life and was managing better than most would have, though our contact had been intermittent since late fall when his antenna had taken storm damage he hadn't been able to fully repair. The second was a woman named Celeste somewhere in Minnesota who checked in on a regular frequency every few days and whose voice I had come to find genuinely comforting even though we had never met and probably never would. The third was a younger man whose name I didn't know, who had transmitted twice from somewhere in Montana and then gone silent in a way that I tried not to think about too hard. 3 people, out of what had once been over 300 million in this country alone. The math was something I had stopped doing on purpose because it led to a darkness that I couldn't afford to sit in for very long. I thought about the bunkers sometimes, especially at night when the wind was loud and the dogs were close, and I had nothing to do but think. The government officials, the military leadership, the selected personnel who had known what was coming before the rest of us did and had used that knowledge to disappear underground while the world burned. There were no broadcasts from them, no announcements, no attempt at contact on any of the frequencies I monitored. Just silence, the same as everything else. But the silence from them felt different. It felt deliberate. I had been in the hills long enough now to know the difference between a silence that meant nothing was there and a silence that meant something was waiting. And whenever I thought about the bunkers, it was the second kind that settled into my chest and stayed there. I tried not to borrow trouble. That was something my grandmother used to say, and it had become a kind of daily mantra in this new life. Do what is in front of you. Tend what needs tending. Don't borrow trouble that isn't here yet. And mostly it worked. Mostly the days were full enough with the physical reality of keeping everything running that the darker thoughts didn't have much room to take hold. But on the quiet evenings, sitting on the porch with Forrest head in my lap and Hunter stretched out at my feet, watching the last of the light leave the tree line, I would feel it sometimes. A low and formless unease, like the feeling you get right before a storm when the air pressure changes, and the birds go quiet, and everything you know is that something is coming even when the sky still looks clear. I didn't know what it was yet. I didn't know how to name it. I just knew that it was there, and that the dogs felt it too, and that was usually enough to make me check the locks before bed and sleep a little lighter than I had the night before. The hunting had become one of the most grounding parts of my week, something I had not expected when I first started going out with Hunter and an old bolt-action 30-06 that had belonged to the previous owner of the property and that I had found in a locked cabinet in a utility shed, along with 4 boxes of ammunition and a cleaning kit. I had never fired a rifle before the virus. I want to be honest about that. I had grown up in the suburbs, worked in an office, lived a life that had no practical overlap with any of the skills I now depended on to stay alive. Everything I knew, I had either taught myself from books I had scavenged from libraries and bookstores, or learned the slow and sometimes painful way through trial and error on the land itself. The hunting had been one of the harder skills to build, not because the deer were scarce. They were everywhere now, moving through the open fields and along the tree lines with a boldness that told you they had noticed the absence of people in a way that animals do, but because killing something cleanly and then processing it properly was a skill with real consequences if you got it wrong. I had gotten it wrong a few times early on, and I carried those mistakes with me with a weight that had made me a more careful and more deliberate hunter than I might have been otherwise. By the second winter, I was consistent, and by this past fall, I had taken 4 deer and 2 elk that I had processed myself and packed into the chest freezer in the basement and the large canning jars that lined the lower shelves. I was not comfortable. Comfortable was a word from a different world. But I was stable, and in this world, stable felt like everything. The supply runs had become a necessary evil, which was how I thought of them, and I scheduled them the way I scheduled everything else on the property, deliberately, with preparation, and with a clear-eyed understanding of what could go wrong and what I would do if it did. I tried to go no more than once a month, sometimes stretching it to 6 weeks if the stores from the previous run had been good. Because every trip out was a risk, and the risk was never zero no matter how many times I had made the drive without incident. The route into Rapid City was about 40 minutes on a clear day, down the county highway to the interstate, and then east of the hills until land opened up and the city appeared in the distance, looking exactly the way you would expect a city to look after 18 months with no one tending it, gutted, pale, and deeply, profoundly still. I drove a 1-ton pickup I had taken from a dealership lot in the early weeks, a diesel with a long bed, and a crew cab that could carry more than my original truck and that had proven itself reliable through 2 hard winters, and I kept it maintained with the obsessive attention I gave to everything mechanical on the property now. Oil changes, fluid checks, tire pressure, a full inspection of the undercarriage every few months. There were no mechanics anymore. If something failed on the road, I was on my own, and the nearest help was a concept that no longer existed. Forrest always came with me on the runs. Hunter usually stayed home, positioned at the property with enough food and water for the day and a dog door that let him move between the house and the fenced yard, because having one dog at home felt safer than leaving the place completely unattended, and Hunter's temperament made him the better guard, while Forrest's steadiness made him the better travel companion. I had a system for the city that I had refined over many trips, a mental map of which stores I had already cleared, which ones still had useful inventory, and which ones I avoided because they had become structurally unsafe or because the smell coming out of them in the warmer months was bad enough that no supply was worth the cost of walking into it. The grocery stores have been useless since the first winter. Anything perishable long since rotted or frozen, and thawed and rotted again into something unrecognizable, and the canned goods aisles have been my first priority in the early weeks, stripped methodically and brought home in load after load until I had more shelf-stable food than I could realistically eat in 2 years. Now the runs were more specific. Hardware stores for tools, fasteners, wire, lumber when I needed it, farm supply stores for livestock medications, feed supplements, fencing materials, medical supply companies and pharmacies for antibiotics, wound care supplies, over-the-counter medications that I stored in a cool, dark corner of the basement with careful inventory logs, so I always knew what I had and what I was running low on. Solar supply and electrical wholesalers for panel components, wiring, connectors, charge controllers, and anything else that kept my power systems running. And canning supplies, always canning supplies, because lids were finite, And the day I ran out of lids was the day my food preservation system started to fail, and I was not going to let that happen. I had located 2 restaurant supply warehouses on the east side of the city that still had significant stock of commercial canning equipment and large format supplies, and I worked through them slowly and methodically, taking what I needed and leaving the rest organized so I could find it again on the next trip. The crematory was on the north edge of the city, a facility I had found in the 3rd month when the bodies in the streets and the buildings had become a problem I could not ignore anymore, not just for practical reasons, but for something deeper that I did not entirely know how to explain. I had not known the people who had died in this city. I had not known most of the people who had died anywhere, but they had been people, and leaving them where they felt like a failure of something important, some basic human obligation that the virus had tried to strip away and that I was determined to hold on to as long as I could. So I had started collecting them. It was slow work, and it was hard work in ways that went beyond the physical, and I did not do it every trip, because some days I did not have the capacity for it, but often enough that the streets and the areas I frequented most were cleaner than they had been, and the crematories logged, which I kept myself in a composition notebook I had found in the facility's office, now held 347 names where I had them and physical descriptions where I did not. It was the closest thing to a record that existed any more of the people who had lived and died in this place, and I kept the notebook on the passenger seat of the truck on every run like it was something sacred, because to me it was. The run I am talking about now happened on a Tuesday in late September. The air already carrying that first cold edge that meant the Black Hills winter was not far off, and that the list of things I needed to accomplish before the first hard freeze was growing faster than I was comfortable with. I had a supply list that covered 2 pages of a legal pad, organized by store and priority, and I moved through it efficiently, Forrest trotting beside me through the empty aisles with his nose working constantly and his body language easy and relaxed, which is a baseline I used to gauge how safe any given environment was. If Forrest was relaxed, I was cautious but calm. If Forrest stiffened, I stopped and paid attention. It was a system that had served me well. I was at the 2nd restaurant supply warehouse loading flats of canning lids into the truck bed when Forrest stopped mid-stride and turned his head toward the street with his ears forward and his tail going still in a way that many had registered something specific, not a smell, but a sound, something outside the building that did not fit the patter of the wind and the distant creak of abandoned infrastructure. I set down the flat I was carrying and stood still and listened, and after a moment I heard it too, the low, distant sound of engines, not one engine, more than one, moving together in a coordinated way that suggested something organized rather than the random mechanical sounds that occasionally drifted through the city from who knew what cause. I moved to the loading dock door and looked out through the gap without opening it further, and I saw them at the end of the block. 2 large military vehicles moving east on the cross street, dark green. No markings I could read from that distance, moving with a deliberate slowness that did not look like patrol and did not look like transit, but looked uncomfortably like search. They were gone from my line of sight in under a minute, swallowed by the buildings further down the street, and the sound of their engines faded after another 30 seconds into the silence that rushed back in to fill the space they had left. I stood at that loading dock door for a long time after that with Forrest pressed against my leg and my hand resting on the pistol at my hip, not drawing it, just touching the way you touch something solid when the ground feels uncertain. Military vehicles, not abandoned, not rusted out, not sitting dead in an intersection the way most of the vehicles in this city were. Running, fueled, driven by someone with a destination and a purpose. My mind went immediately to the bunkers, which was the only place I could think of that had the fuel and the organization, and the reason to be running military equipment through a dead city 18 months after the world had ended. I thought about the deliberate silence I had always felt from that direction, the absence of any broadcast or contact, and I thought about the slowness of those vehicles, the searching quality of their movement, and a cold and specific fear settled into my chest that was different from the general unease I had been carrying for months. This was not formless. This had a shape. I finished loading the truck with less attention to my supply list than I usually gave it, taking what was already staged and skipping the second half of the warehouse entirely, and I drove home a different way than I had come, adding 20 minutes to the trip by looping south through the edge of the hills before cutting back to the county highway, watching the mirrors the entire way, and seeing nothing behind me but empty road and the long shadows of late afternoon. I did not tell Dale or Celeste about the vehicles on the radio that night. I did not know yet what I was dealing with, and I had learned early that spreading fear without information was its own kind of damage. Instead, I sat on the porch in the cooling dark with Forrest and Hunter flanking me and a cup of tea gone cold in my hands, watching the distant sweep of the hills against the last of the light, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid and doing a poor job of it. The lock on the front door felt important when I finally went inside, and I checked every window before I went to bed, and I lay awake longer than usual listening to the wind and the generators and that deep, encompassing silence beneath everything, waiting for something in it to change. The next morning, I made myself go through the regular routine, because the routine was what kept me functional, and I could not afford to let a sighting of military vehicles undo the discipline I had built over a year and a half of survival. I fed the chickens and checked the cows and pulled eggs and noted the milk yield in my log and started a fire in the wood stove to knock back the chill that had settled into the house overnight. Hunter patrolled the fence line the way he did every morning, methodical and unhurried, and I watched him from the porch with my coffee and tried to read his body language the way I always did. He was calm. Whatever was in the hills around us this morning was nothing that concerned him, and I let that settle me somewhat even as another part of my mind kept returning to those vehicles, the slowness of them, the searching quality of that movement, the fact that whoever was driving them had fuel and organization, and a reason to be in that dead city that I could not identify and could not dismiss. I added 2 new items to the bottom of my maintenance log that morning, things I had been putting off because they had not felt urgent and now suddenly did. The first was reinforcing the gate at the end of the access road with a heavier chain and a better lock. The second was scouting the ridge above the property for a vantage point I had been thinking about for months, a spot in the rocks above the tree line where I could see the highway in both directions and the access road for its full length without being visible from below. I had the materials for both. I had the time if I made the time. I started on the gate that afternoon, working until the light was gone, and when I went inside and sat down to eat, I felt better for having done something concrete with the fear, rather than just carrying it. Concrete action was the only answer I had ever found for a particular weight of living alone at the edge of the world, and it had not failed me yet. It was 10 days after the supply run when I found him, and in a way that significant things sometimes happen. It started as nothing more than a routine morning scout along the eastern fence line, the kind of walk I did 2 or 3 times a week to check for downed wire and predator activity around the chicken coop, and to let Hunter work his nose through the grass and brush at the property edge in a way that seemed to satisfy something deep in him, and that I had come to think of as useful. Intelligence gathering even when he found nothing worth noting. The morning was cold and bright, one of those early October days in the Black Hills where the sky is so blue it looks artificial and the light on the pines has that hard, clean quality that only comes after the first real frost has started burning off the summer haze. I had my rifle slung across my back and my sidearm on my hip and a small pack with water and basic supplies, the same loadout I carried on any walk that took me more than 100 yards from the house, because the habit of being prepared had long since stopped feeling like paranoia and had become as automatic as putting on shoes. Forrest was ranging ahead of me along the fence line, his nose sweeping the ground in long, lazy arcs, while Hunter worked the thicker brush about 30 yards to my right, where a shallow drainage ditch ran parallel to the fence before cutting south toward the lower pasture. I was thinking about firewood, which was something I thought about with increasing frequency as fall deepened, running the mental math on how many cords I had split and stacked against the shed and how many I would need to carry the house through a full South Dakota winter without drawing down the propane backup more than absolutely necessary. The calculation was not quite where I wanted it, which meant more cutting and splitting in the next few weeks before the snow made the down timber I had been working through harder to access. I was deep enough into this particular calculation that I almost missed it when Hunter stopped. Not the gradual slowdown he did when he was following a scent trail that was going cold, but a full, abrupt stop, his body going rigid from nose to tail in a single motion that cut through my distraction like a blade. I stopped immediately and looked at him, reading his posture the way I had learned to read it over a year and a half of depending on it. His head was up, not down, which meant this was not a ground scent. His ears were forward and slightly cupped, angled toward the drainage ditch about 15 yards ahead of him. His tail was level, not raised in the aggression line, not tucked in fear, but held exactly horizontal in the posture that I had come to associate with something alive and unknown, something that did not fit the pattern of the deer and fox and occasional coyote that made up the regular wildlife vocabulary of this land. I brought the rifle off my shoulder slowly, not raising it, just holding it across my body with my finger outside the trigger guard, and I moved up to where Hunter stood and looked in the direction he was looking. At first I saw nothing. The drainage ditch was shallow here, maybe 2 feet deep, choked with the dry remnants of late-season grass, and a few scrubby willows that grew along its edge in a broken line. Then one of the shapes that I had read as a clump of dead grass moved slightly, a slow and uncoordinated movement that did not match the wind, and I understood that it was not dead grass at all. I moved closer, keeping Hunter at my side with a hand signal, and I saw the boots first. Military boots, dark and mud-caked, attached to legs in camouflage pants that were dark with what I recognized after a moment as dry blood along the right thigh. I moved around the edge of the ditch to get a better angle and saw the rest of him, a man, broad-shouldered and tall, even folded into the shallow depression of the ditch, his face turned sideways against the dead grass with his eyes closed and his lips parted and his skin carrying that particular waxy, gray-edged color that I associated with fever, because I had seen it in the mirror once during a bad flu years ago and had never forgotten it. He was alive. I could see the shallow rise and fall of his chest from 6 feet away, slow and labored but present. Forrest had come up beside me by then, and I put my hand on his head to keep him still while I stood and looked at this man and ran through the calculation that the situation demanded as fast and as honestly as I could. Military, injured, feverish, out here alone, which meant either separated from a unit or deliberately apart from one. And given what I had seen in the city 10 days ago, the question of which one of those it was mattered enormously. The wound on his thigh looked old enough that it had not happened this morning, maybe 2 or 3 days old based on the state of the dry blood, and the swelling I could see even through the fabric of his pants. He had been out here for days, then wounded and feverish and alone, and the fact that he was still alive was either a testament to his physical toughness or a sign that he had not been here as long as the wound suggested, and I did not yet know which. I stood there for longer than I am comfortable admitting, long enough that Forrest looked up at me once with an expression I can only describe as patient, as though he understood the weight of what I was deciding and was willing to wait for me to work through it. The arguments against helping were clear, and I gave them their due. He could be from the bunkers. He could be a scout. He could be bait for something I had not figured out yet. If I brought him onto property and he was connected to whoever had been driving those vehicles through Rapid City, I was not just risking myself. I was potentially leading them directly to the one place I could not afford to lose. The arguments for helping were less tactical and more human, and I gave them their due as well. He was a person. He was injured and feverish, and he'd been lying in a drainage ditch for days in the cold. And if I walked away from him, he would almost certainly be dead before tomorrow morning, and I would know that I had made that choice, and I would carry it. I thought about the notebook on the passenger seat of my truck, the 347 names and descriptions of people who had not made it, and I thought about what it meant that I had bothered to keep that record at all, and I knew the answer before I finished the thought. I knelt down in the grass at the edge of the ditch and put 2 fingers against the side of his neck and found his pulse, fast and thready in the way that fever pulses are, and said quietly, more to myself than to him, that I was going to need the truck. He did not respond. I had not expected him to. I left Hunter sitting beside him with a steady command that Hunter took as seriously as any command I had ever given him, and I jogged back to the house and got the truck and drove out along the fence line as far as the terrain allowed, which got me to within about 50 yards of the ditch. Close enough. Getting him into the truck was the hardest part, not because he was unresponsive, but because he was partially responsive, surfacing enough in the fever to be confused and resistant in the uncoordinated way of someone who is not fully conscious, pushing weakly against my hands and saying something I could not understand, a word or a name repeated in a low and urgent tone that I could not make out. I talked to him steadily while I worked, the same calm, low voice I used with the livestock when they were distressed, telling him he was okay, telling him I was not going to hurt him, telling him I was taking him somewhere warm. And eventually his resistance faded, and I got him onto the rear seat of the crew cab with his leg elevated on a rolled sleeping bag, and Forrest wedged him beside him in a way that I had not asked for, but that seemed to help the dog's warm weight against the man's side, settling him in a way that my voice alone had not quite managed. I drove back to the house carefully, watching him in the rear-view mirror the whole way, and I noted that even unconscious and feverish, he was solidly built, probably 6 feet and 190 pounds, with the kind of physical conditioning that came from a military lifestyle, and that would work in his favor in the coming days if the infection had not already gotten too far ahead of him. I would know more once I got him inside, and got a proper look at the wound. I had a medical kit in the back bedroom that I had built up over 18 months of careful scavenging, stocked with antibiotics and wound care supplies and suture materials, and everything else I had been able to pull from pharmacies and medical supply companies on my city runs. And I had taught myself enough from the books I had collected to be confident in basic wound care, even if I was under no illusions about being a doctor. He needed real medicine, and he needed warmth and fluids and rest, and those were things I could provide. I got him inside and onto the bed in the spare room with considerably more effort than getting him into the truck had required, and I cut away the fabric around the wound and looked at it under good light. And what I found was serious but not unsurvivable if I acted quickly. A puncture wound, entry only, no exit, deep in the muscle of the outer thigh, the tissue around it hot and swollen, and showing the early signs of infection that I had hoped not to see but had expected. I cleaned it as thoroughly as I dared, packed it with the antibiotic dressing I had for exactly this kind of injury, started him on oral antibiotics as soon as I could get water into him, and covered him with every blanket in the house, because his temperature, when I finally got a reading on the thermometer, was 103.4, and the shivering had started. Forrest and Hunter stationed themselves at the door of the spare room, and I sat beside the bed and watched this stranger breathe through the night as his fever climbed to 104 before finally breaking just before dawn, leaving him limp and pale but breathing easier. When the sun came through the window, he opened his eyes fully for the first time and looked at me with an expression that moved through confusion and fear before settling into a deliberate stillness, like a decision he was making in real time about how much to show. What he said was not "thank you," and it was not "where am I." What he said, quietly enough that I had to lean forward to hear it, was this: "You should not have brought me here." His name was Jared, and he told me that on the second day, when the fever had dropped enough that he could hold a conversation without losing the thread of it halfway through, I had brought him broth that morning. A bone broth I had simmering on the back of the wood stove that was rich enough to put some color back into a person, and he had pushed himself up against the headboard and taken the mug in both hands and looked at me over the rim of it with those careful, measuring eyes that I was already coming to recognize as his default expression, the face of a man who had learned to assess everything around him before deciding how much of himself to offer. I told him my name and he told me his. And for a few minutes, that was the entire extent of our conversation. Two people sitting in a spare bedroom in an off-grid house in the Black Hills of South Dakota, drinking broth and taking a measure of each other in the particular silence of people who understand that what gets said in the next little while might matter quite a lot. I asked him where he was from, and he said originally Nebraska, which told me nothing about where he had been more recently. I asked him how long he'd been out in the field before I found him, and he thought about it for a moment and said he believed it was 3 days, maybe 4, which matched my estimate of the wound and explained the depth of the fever. I asked him how he had been injured, and this was where the careful eyes went a degree more careful, and he was quiet for long enough that I thought he had decided not to answer. And then he said that he had been shot, which I already knew, and that it had happened while he was leaving somewhere he was not supposed to leave. I did not push further that morning. He was not well enough for the full conversation, and I was not sure I was ready for it, because I had a feeling that whatever he had to tell me was going to change the texture of my days in some way that I could not yet predict and was not entirely sure I wanted. I gave him more broth and more water and checked the wound, which was improving faster than I had dared hope on the first night, and I left him to sleep and went out to do the morning chores with Forrest and Hunter at my heels, and the cold October air on my face, and the familiar weight of everything that needed doing pressing in around me like a kind of comfort. Over the next 3 days, he improved steadily, moving from the bed to the chair to the window, and on the 4th day, he appeared in the kitchen doorway in the morning while I was making coffee, moving carefully on the injured leg but upright, and he said that he thought he could help with something if I told him what needed doing. I told him to sit down and let the leg finish healing, and he gave me a look that suggested he was not accustomed to being told to sit down, and I gave him a look back that suggested I was not particularly concerned about that, and he sat down. We ate breakfast together, eggs and canned tomatoes, and the last a loaf of bread I had baked 2 days before, and the strangeness of having another person at the table was so profound that I had to look out the window for a moment to collect myself, because I had not eaten with another human being in over a year, and the simple ordinariness of it hit me somewhere undefended. He told me the rest of it that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and the low gray light of an overcast October day coming through the window behind him, and he told it the way a person tells something they've been carrying alone for a long time, not dramatically, not in a rush, but carefully and in order, like he was laying out in front of himself as much as for my benefit and checking each piece of it as it came. The bunker he had come from was a federal facility built into the rock of a mountain range I will not name here for reasons that will become clear, designed to house up to 400 people for a period of up to 3 years on sealed internal systems, military-grade air filtration, deep water reserves, food stores that had been built up for decades against exactly the kind of catastrophic scenario that had actually happened. Jared had been assigned there as part of a military security detail 18 months ago, in the final 72 hours before the surface was sealed, when it had become clear to the people with the classified models that the virus was not going to be contained and that the survival protocol was being activated. He had not chosen to go. His unit had been ordered, and in the world that existed in those final hours, orders were still orders, and the alternative was being left on the surface. And so he had gone. The first 6 months had been functional. He said, using that word with a flatness that told me functional was doing a lot of work. There was food and water and power and a chain of command and regular briefings on surface conditions that were, he believed now, heavily edited versions of the actual data, but which at the time had provided enough structure to keep 400 people from fully understanding that they had no timeline for going back up. It was around the 8-month mark that things had started to deteriorate in ways that the facility's design had not accounted for, which was not the mechanical systems, which mostly held, but the human ones. For 100 people sealed in a mountain with no horizon, and no outside, and no real information about whether there was a world left to go back to, run by a command structure that had been designed for wartime emergency, and that did not transition well into the indefinite management of a captive civilian and military population that had begun to grasp, slowly and then all at once, that the people in charge were making decisions that prioritized the comfort and security of a very small group at the top, at the direct expense of everyone else. Rations had been cut. Not for everyone, Jared clarified, his voice level and precise, for the lower tiers. The facility had a tier system that he described with straightforwardness that I found more disturbing than if he had shown anger. A hierarchy of access and allocation that put senior government officials and high-ranking military brass at the top with full rations and private quarters and to preserve amenities of civilized life. And that put the lower enlisted military personnel and the civilian technical workers who kept the facility systems running at the bottom with reduced rations, shared sleeping spaces, and an increasing set of restrictions on movement and communication within the facility that he described, again with that same flat precision, as a prison, and said that was the word that most of them had started using privately around month 10. There had been 2 organized protests, both suppressed quickly and, in the case of the second one, violently. 3 people had died in the second suppression, one of them a 22-year-old private from Ohio, whose name Jared told me, and whose face he described in a particular detail of someone who had been present and who was not going to let himself forget. After that, the restrictions had tightened further, and the lower tiers had learned to communicate carefully and quietly, and a plan with a patience that the people at the top probably interpreted as submission, and that was not submission at all. Jared had been part of a group of 11 who had been planning their exit for 4 months by the time an opportunity came during a surface supply run, one of the infrequent operations the facility ran, to collect specific materials from pre-identified caches within a 100-mile radius. He had been assigned to the run because he was security detail, and he used that assignment with 3 others who were also part of the plan, and they had broken from the run in 2 vehicles and driven in different directions and scattered into the landscape, and he had not heard from the other 3 since, which was a sentence he delivered in the same level tone he had used for everything else, and that landed in the room between us with a weight that neither of us addressed directly. He had been shot from the facility's vehicle before he got beyond its range. A single round that caught in the thigh, and that had not stopped him, but had slowed him enough over the following days that he had ended up in my drainage ditch barely conscious, which was where I came in. When he finished, I sat with it for a moment, looking at the grain of the kitchen table, thinking about 400 people sealed in a mountain with their rations cut and their movements restricted and their protests answered with violence. Thinking about the tier system and the private quarters at the top and the shared sleeping spaces at the bottom. Thinking about the 22-year-old from Ohio. I asked Jared what the people in charge thought they were building, what their stated plan was for the world after the facility opened, and he looked at me with those careful eyes and said that was the part he thought I really needed to understand, and that the plan, as far as he'd been able to piece it together from the things he had heard and seen in 18 months of close proximity to the people making it, was not a plan for rebuilding the world that had existed before. It was a plan for building something else entirely, something designed around a population that was now small enough to control and a power structure that intended to be the one doing controlling, and that the 2% of the surface population that had survived through natural immunity, people like me, were not a factor they had planned for and not one they were comfortable with. He let that settle for a moment, and then he said he thought that the vehicles he had heard me mention, the ones I had seen in Rapid City, were almost certainly a search pattern, and that they were not only looking for him. I got up and poured more coffee and stood at the counter for a moment with my back to him, looking out the window at the tree line, at the hills above the property, at the long open slope that anyone coming down that access road would have to cross in plain sight. Then I turned around and told him he could stay as long as he needed to, that I had room, and I had food, and I had work that needed doing, and that a second set of hands before the South Dakota winter came in hard would be more useful than I could easily put into words. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he nodded, and I saw something shift his expression, not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it, but something that looked more like the particular relief of a person who has been carrying an enormous weight alone and has just been told, for the first time in longer than they can clearly remember, that they do not have to. That evening I sat on the porch with Forrest and Hunter and listened to the wind generator spin in the dark and thought about everything Jared had told me. And somewhere out beyond the tree line, far enough that I could not hear it, but close enough that I could feel it, a set of headlights turned onto the county highway and began moving toward my access road. I saw the headlights from the porch before I heard the engine. Two pale smears of light moving through the gap in the tree line where the county highway ran east to west about a quarter mile below the property. And for a moment, I told myself it was nothing. That vehicles still moved sometimes for reasons that had nothing to do with me. That the world was large enough that two headlights on a highway did not automatically mean what my stomach was already telling me it meant. Then the lights slowed and turned, and I watched it begin the long climb of my access road. And I was off the porch into the front door before the sound of the engine reached the house. Jared was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a glass of water, and when he saw my face, he set the glass down without a word and straightened the way I had already come to recognize as him shifting from recovered person into something older and more trained, a readiness that came into his body like a current switching on. I told him quietly that we had a vehicle coming up the road, and that I needed him in the back bedroom with the door closed, and I needed him to stay there regardless of what he heard, and I needed him to be completely silent. He nodded once and moved without argument or question down the hall, and I heard the bedroom door close with a soft and careful click that I felt more than heard. I locked Forrest in the back bedroom with him, because Forrest was friendly to strangers in a way that could be read as familiarity rather than general temperament, and I brought Hunter to the front room, because Hunter's alertness around strangers read as normal dog behavior, and because I wanted him where I could see him, where his body language could tell me things that I might not be able to read for myself in whatever was about to happen. I checked my sidearm, not drawing it, just confirming it was where it was supposed to be, and then I went to the front window and looked out to the gap in the curtain and watched the vehicle finish the climb and pull into a flat area in front of the house. And then a second vehicle pulled in behind it, and any remaining possibility that this was something benign left me in a single cold exhale. Two military trucks, the same dark green the first had seen in Rapid City, both running, both with their headlights on, flooding the front of the house with a flat white light that made the porch look staged. I watched two men get out of the lead vehicle, both in uniform, both moving with a deliberate efficiency of people who were comfortable in situations that were designed to make other people uncomfortable, and I noted the sidearms on their hips and the way the man on the passenger side let his hand rest near his without quite touching it, and I took one breath and opened the front door and stepped onto the porch before they could knock, because I had decided in the 10 seconds between the window and the door that being found waiting inside was worse than being found standing outside, that a woman alone on her porch with her dog was a simpler and less suspicious picture than a woman who had been watching from the window and had needed a moment to compose herself. I said good evening in a voice that came out steadier than I had any right to expect, and Hunter pressed against my leg and watched him with his ears forward and his tail still. The man in front was maybe 40, square-faced and pale, with the kind of physical stillness that comes from training rather than calm, and he introduced himself with a name I did not retain because I was too focused on reading everything else about him to allocate memory to names. He was polite in the surface way of someone who has a great deal of authority and is choosing, for the moment, not to exercise it overtly. He said they were conducting a welfare check in the area and asked how long I had been at this location and whether I had seen anyone in the surrounding area in the past 2 weeks. And the word anyone landed with a specific weight that told me the question was not general even though it had been phrased that way. I told him I had been at this property since before the virus, that I had been here the whole time and intended to stay, and that I had not seen another living person in several months. He absorbed this with no visible reaction, and then he asked if I had been into Rapid City recently, and I told him yes, that I made regular supply runs into the city, and that I also made a point of clearing bodies from the areas I worked through and taking them to the crematory on the north end city, which I did because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because I kept a record of the people I found there in case it was ever useful to anyone. The mention of the crematory landed in a small but perceptible way, a slight adjustment of focus in his eyes, and the man behind him shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, and I understood that this was a detail that had given them pause, that a woman alone out here performing that particular civic function was not what they had been expecting, and I filed that observation away and used it. I told them that on my last run, maybe 10 days ago, I had found a man in one of the streets on the east side of the city, military from the look of his uniform, already dead, and that I had not been able to identify him from the tags because they had been removed, but that he had been tall and broad-shouldered and had a wound on his right thigh that had clearly gone septic before he died, and that I had done what I always did, which was loaded him into the truck and taken him to the crematory and burned him with the others. I told them I had the date in my log if they needed it, and I could describe where I found him if that was helpful, and I gave them a cross street on the east side that I knew well because I had cleared it twice and could describe it accurately enough to be convincing. I told them that after I burned the bodies, I always said something over them, that I did not think it was right to burn a person without saying something, and that I had said something over him too, even though I did not know his name. And I said this last part not because it was strategically useful, though it was, but because it was also true, because that was something I actually did, and the truest parts of a lie are always the ones that hold it up. The man in front was quiet for a moment, and I met his eyes steadily and waited, and Hunter pressed a little harder against my leg as though he understood the importance of stillness right now. And then the man nodded slowly and said that was very thorough of me, and the way he said it told me he had not yet decided whether to believe it and was choosing to proceed as though he had for the time being. He asked if he could have my contact frequency, and I gave him the ham radio frequency I used for Dale and Celeste, and that I monitored regularly, and he wrote it down with the same careful thoroughness with which he had done everything else, and I noted that detail too. The fact that he wrote it down rather than entering it anywhere electronic, which told me something about how they were operating that I did not yet fully understand, but that felt important. He said they appreciated my cooperation, and that they would likely be in the area again and hoped they could count on me to report anything unusual, and I said, of course, that I understood the importance of coordination, that there were not enough of us left to afford not to help each other, and I delivered this with the right amount of quiet earnestness and watched and decide, fractionally, to find it credible. They got back in the vehicles, and I stood on the porch with Hunter and watched the headlights go back down the access road and turn onto the highway and disappear, and I stood there for another full minute after the sound of the engines had faded before I went back inside and walked down the hall and knocked on the back bedroom door and told Jared they were gone. He opened the door and looked at me, and I could see that he had heard enough into the wall to understand most of what had happened, and his expression held something complicated that I did not try to parse right then, because I was still running on the specific adrenaline of having just lied to armed men at my front door, and my hands were not entirely steady. I told him what I had said, all of it, including the part about finding his body in the east side of the city and burning it at the crematory, and I told him that the story would hold up if they wanted to check it, because the crematory records I kept were real and detailed, and because I had cleared that street and could describe it, and because everything I had said about my habits there was true, and the true parts would carry the false ones if they looked. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I was done he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that they would go to Rapid City, that the man in front was thorough, and that thorough men check things, and that when they found the records and the cleared streets and the burned remains, they would probably let it go for now, but that probably was not the same as certainly, and that I needed to understand what it meant that they now knew I existed and where I lived. I told him I understood that. I told him I had understood at the moment I opened the front door. He asked me why I had done it, why I had lied for someone I had known less than 2 weeks, and I thought about it honestly for a moment, standing in the hallway of my house with Forrest leaning against my knee and the wind generators turning the dark outside. And I told him that I had heard what he told me about that facility and what they were building in that mountain, and that I had looked at the man on my porch and recognized the architecture of it. The politeness that was a form of pressure, the thoroughness that was a form of control, and that I had decided in that moment that whatever side I was on, it was not theirs. He nodded and said nothing more, and I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on because my hands needed something to do and the night was cold, and what just happened deserved at least a ritual of tea. And outside in the dark the wind picked up, and the generators turned faster, and somewhere far off, just at the edge of hearing, I thought I caught the faint sound of a helicopter moving across the hills, though I told myself it might only have been the wind. The days that followed had a quality I can only describe as held breath. Every morning beginning with the same routine, but carrying underneath it a new and constant layer of attention. The way you move through a familiar room after you have reason to believe something in it has been disturbed. Touching the surfaces, checking the corners, reassuring yourself that everything is where you left it, while knowing that the reassurance is only partial, and that the knowing is the price of the caution. Jared settled into the work of the property with seriousness that I had not expected, and that I found, once I let myself notice it, genuinely useful in ways that went beyond the practical. He was up before me most mornings, or at least awake when I came out, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee in the gray pre-dawn quiet, and he had taken over the firewood operation with thoroughness that addressed one of the things I had been most anxious about going into the winter. He could swing an axe for hours in a way that my shoulders could not match, and the stack behind the shed grew in a steady and satisfying way over the first 2 weeks that put me substantially ahead of where I had been at the same point the previous year. We worked well together in the way that people who are both task-oriented and not prone to unnecessary conversation sometimes do, falling into a rhythm across the different jobs of the day that required little discussion, because we were both watching the same things and drawing the same conclusions from them. Hunter had accepted him on about the 5th day, which in my experience with Hunter was faster than usual and which I took as information worth noting. Forrest had accepted him immediately, which was less diagnostic given Forrest's general view that all humans were probably fine, but which still contributed to the overall picture. The soldiers did not come back in the first week or the second, and I began to let the held breath quality of the days ease fractionally, not releasing it entirely because I was not sure I ever would again, but loosening it enough that I could sleep through most of the night without surfacing at every sound from the property. Jared had told me he thought they had likely gone to Rapid City and found enough there to make my story plausible, and that men like the one on my porch tended to move on when the immediate trail went cold, filing the location and the contact frequency away for later rather than committing resources to a dead end. He said later in a way that reminded me the reprieve was not a resolution, and I heard it and filed it the same way I filed everything that required long-term attention, in the part of my mind that ran quietly in the background of everything else. We found the meat cattle in the 3rd week of October. On a drive, I took out east to check a stretch of highway I had not scouted since late summer. They were 12 in number, a mix of breeds that had clearly been living rough since the farm they came from had been abandoned, lean and wary and moving in a loose group along a fence line that had partially collapsed and was no longer containing them in any meaningful way. Jared was with me that day, his leg well enough by then for the drive, though not yet for anything more strenuous, and we sat in the truck for a while and looked at them and talked through the logistics of getting them back to property, which were considerable but not insurmountable. It took 2 full days, 3 trips with the stock trailer, and 1 genuinely difficult hour involving a bull who had opinions about the trailer that differed substantially from ours, but we got them onto property and into the lower pasture and patched the fence in a hold'em, and that evening I stood at the pasture gate and looked at 12 cattle grazing in the last of the October light, and felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was something close to abundance. We ate well that night, a proper meal with venison I had thawed from the freezer, and the last of the summer squash from the root cellar, and fresh bread that Jared had apparently learned to make from his grandmother, and that was I told him honestly, better than mine. He looked pleased in a restrained way he had of showing pleasure, a slight softening around the eyes and a quality of stillness that was different from his watchful stillness, warmer, and I noted the difference and said nothing about it because noting it was enough. There was a day in early November, one of those clear, cold days when the Black Hills looked like something from a painting, all dark pine and pale rock and sky. So blue it seemed to go back forever when we went out together on a deer hunt, and came back with 2 that we processed together in the afternoon in an easy division of labor that required no discussion. And afterward we sat on the porch in the cold with coffee and watched the light leave the hills, and neither of us spoke for a long time, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, but the other kind, the kind that exists between people who have arrived at some understanding that does not need to be stated. I thought about what that understanding was, sitting there with the cold coming in off the hills and forests, weight against my leg, and the steam rising off my coffee, and I thought it was something like this, that what we were building here, the 2 of us and the dogs and the cattle and the chickens and the solar array and the wood stack behind the shed and the 800 jars in the basement, was something real, something that functioned and produced and endured, and that having another person who understood the weight of that and was willing to carry their share was not something to take lightly in a world where most of the people who might have done so were gone. There was also the other thing, the thing I did not examine too directly, which was that I had not minded the sound of another person in the house, the particular geography of someone else's routines moving through the same space as mine, the coffee made before I was up and the way of his presence in the kitchen doorway, and the easy way he moved through the work of the days, and that not minding it had become, somewhere in the past few weeks, something more active than that, though I was not, yet ready to call it by a more specific name. The hunting had become something we did together more often than not by the second week of November, and Jared moved to the hills with quiet and practiced ease that was different from my own self-taught approach, but that produced the same results. And I had come to enjoy the particular rhythm of hunting with another person, the way you develop a shared language of hand signals and eye contact, and small gestures that communicate across distance without sound, a vocabulary built out of necessity and repetition that felt, in its small way, like its own kind of intimacy. We came back from those mornings with meat more often than not, and the freezer in the basement was building toward a level of fullness that made me feel something I recognized after a moment as security, a word I had not been able to apply in my life in any honest way since the world had ended, and that I was almost afraid to use now in case the using of it made it fragile. He had found the radio in the second week, or rather he had found what was left of it, a ham unit in the back bedroom that I used for contact with Dale and Celeste, but that had been having intermittent power issues since the summer that I had not had the electrical knowledge to diagnose. He had looked at it for a while without asking permission, which I let pass because his expression was a focused and purposeful look of someone who knew what they were looking at. And then he had asked if I minded if he worked on it, and I had said no. He spent parts of several evenings at the small desk in the back bedroom with the unit open in front of him and a lamp pulled close, working through it with methodical patience that reminded me of the way he did everything. And on a Wednesday evening in the second week of November, he appeared in the kitchen doorway and said that it was fixed and that he had also, while he was in there, extended the antenna configuration in a way that should significantly increase the range of what I could reach and what could reach me. I went into the back bedroom and sat down at the desk and keyed the radio and listened to the static and the familiar frequencies and felt the particular gratitude of having something important restored. And then I began scanning the extended range that the new antenna configuration allowed, and the static shifted and moved through patterns I had not heard before, and then, on a frequency I had never reached before, I heard a voice. It was a woman's voice, clear enough that I could hear the exhaustion in it and the carefulness. The way a person speaks when they have been speaking into a void for long enough that they have stopped expecting a response, but are not yet willing to stop trying. She was giving coordinates, reading them steadily and then repeating them, and she was saying that she was alive and that there were others with her and that they had shelter and water and that they were looking for anyone who could hear this. Jared had followed me into the room and was standing behind me, and I felt him go still in a particular way. He went still when something had his full attention, and I reached for the transmit key and then stopped because I was looking at the coordinates she had given, reading them against the map on the wall beside the desk where I had marked every location of significance I had identified in 18 months of survival, and something in the numbers was pulling at a recognition I could not immediately place. I looked at them for another moment, and then I placed it, and the cold that moved through me had nothing to do with the November air coming to the gaps in the window frame. I turned in my chair and looked at Jared, and I could see from his face that he had been doing the same math and had arrived at the same place, because his jaw had set in the way it set when he was controlling a reaction, and his eyes had gone to the careful and distant place they went when he was thinking through something that required all of his attention. The coordinates the woman was broadcasting from, the coordinates she was giving openly on an open frequency to anyone who could receive them, were inside the perimeter of the facility he had escaped from. I held the transmit key in my hand and did not key it, and the woman's voice continued steadily through the static, giving the coordinates again, patient and exhausted and real, and I looked at Jared, and he looked at me, and neither of us spoke, and Forrest pressed against my leg, and outside the window the wind moved through the pines, and the generators turned in the dark, and the November night settled over the Black Hills with all of its cold and different weight, and I understood for first time in a long time that I had absolutely no idea what happened next.